Have you ever responded to a help wanted sign? Have you ever applied for or been offered a job in which you were sure you were way underqualified? I can remember back to the time when I was leaving Victoria after my undergraduate degree and moving to Vancouver to live with my parents. I had taken a spring and summer course, spring and summer courses in my degree so that I could finish my degree early. And I did that so that I could get back to Vancouver quicker and I could have 18 months in which I could be earning some money so that I could make enough to then head off to England to go to seminary. Well, this was back in the mid-'80s, and there weren't a lot of help-wanted signs around. I can remember the first few weeks of my job search, treating that job search as a job in itself. I'd be out of the door 8:30 in the morning, and I wouldn't get back until about 5 in the afternoon, going from place to place to place, dropping off a resume in the hope that I might get something. And each day I'd be coming home more and more dejected. Well, one of the places that I submitted a resume was to a large camera store in Vancouver. I had a keen interest in photography. I knew SLR cameras pretty well, and I even had my own darkroom and developed my own prints. I thought a job at a camera store would be the perfect place for me. Now, most places that I applied to, I didn't hear anything back from. But from the camera store, I did get a call and an invitation to come for an interview. And it was for a computer job. Now, it seemed strange at the time, but this camera store was branching out into a computer business, and they called me up. And it was because on my resume, I had put just a little note that I had an interest in computers. What I hadn't said, that I really didn't know a lot about them, though. I mean, I could turn one on fairly easily. I liked some of the things that computers did, and I knew some very, very basic things about computers. But no real training. I didn't even own a computer myself. I went to the interview, but as it unfolded, it was clear that they were looking for somebody to head up their new computer department. I knew I would be in way over my head. I tried to sound intelligent in the interview, but in the end, I just had to tell them that I was the wrong guy. They might need some help, but that help wasn't coming from me. Have you ever applied for or been offered something that seemed way over your skill level? The prospect of such a thing can feel so daunting. Now, our reading this morning from Matthew's Jesus story, we heard a story about a calling from Jesus to his disciples. And I want us to explore that reading, to hear what Jesus was saying to those disciples, and to listen for what Jesus is saying to us as we too seek to be Jesus' disciples today. And I want to title the sermon today, Help Wanted. Now, just so we get an understanding of our bearings, where are we in the context of the story? Now, for a number of weeks, we have moved away from Matthew's Jesus story. We were looking at Matthew's Jesus story earlier on, before Lent. We heard the Sermon on the Mount and things that Jesus was saying in that sermon. Then during Lent and the Easter season, we left Matthew. Now we're back in the story. We've skipped a little bit. We've skipped parts of chapter 8 and 9. Some of the things we've missed. Some of the healings that Jesus did. Time when Jesus healed a paralytic. Jesus was out teaching and he was healing. Well, now we're back in the story. We don't know how long the disciples at this point have been with Jesus. But the sense is that they've likely been with him for some time now. They've seen Jesus in action. They've been with him as he's taught the people. They've seen how he has lived and how he has pointed people to God. Yet I often wonder if it really dawned on those disciples what they were doing. I think at the time of at the time of Jesus' first calling to them, they couldn't really have known what they were getting into. I mean, sure, there was something about him that drew them to him, but I don't really think they'd thought it through all that much. I mean, this was a new model of discipleship. Usually when disciples went to follow a rabbi, it was the disciple that sought out a particular rabbi and asked the rabbi if they could become a disciple. Well, this was much different. This now was Jesus approaching potential disciples and saying, "Come and follow me." I'm not sure whether those disciples would ever even have considered the possibility of becoming a disciple of a teacher, of a rabbi. Probably because they wouldn't have felt very qualified. But here was somebody inviting them. And so they took that first step in following. And in time, they might have even started to hope that one day they might actually become like their rabbi, their master. And that was the hope of all disciples, to become like their master. And yet I wonder if it ever dawned on those disciples that they might be sent off in mission. I mean, sure, they were happy to follow Jesus in his mission. They were quite happy to tag along behind. But I doubt it even crossed their minds that he might call them to service, that he might send them off on their own. And yet that's what we see in our reading today. As our passage opened today, we heard about a time when, in essence, Jesus posted a sign which said "Help Wanted." And listen to the verses, the passage opens. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." I wonder what the disciples thought when they heard those words from Jesus. Perhaps some might have prayed the very prayer that Jesus was asking them. "Oh God, please send workers to help Jesus with his harvest." I wonder whether it dawned on those disciples that they might be the answer to the prayer. There's a great story in the book of Isaiah about the time when Isaiah was in the temple and was experiencing the presence of God, and the glory of God was around him. And he felt unworthy. God then did something and touched him. And then there were these words where God said, "Who will I send? Who can I send?" And Isaiah at that moment said, "Here I am, send me." Isaiah was keen to respond to the call of God. You know, as I think about the disciples, I don't think that they were anything close to as keen as Isaiah was in responding to the call. They, I think, were surprised that Jesus would have been asking them to be the workers. I'm sure they thought, "Lord, please send somebody else." Please, particularly when they realized that Jesus wouldn't be following along behind them. Now, maybe I'm being a bit too hard on those disciples. Maybe they would have been eager. But when I look at the disciples, I see people like you and me. And I know how many of us, when we hear a challenging call from Jesus, we assume that there might be somebody else who's more qualified. Somebody else who's been a Christian longer. Somebody else who knows their Bible better. Somebody else who's had a bit more training than we've had. Lord, it's a great call, it's a great commission, but please send somebody else. Yet I don't know whether you noticed or not, a common theme in our readings the past 4 Sundays has been the theme of being witnesses. A few Sundays back, we heard the story of Jesus' ascension, and Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses." At Pentecost, the disciples were empowered by God and they went out and became witnesses. Last week in the gospel reading, we heard Jesus give his commission, the Great Commission. Go out into all the world and make disciples. Today we have the same theme. Over and over and over again. The call just keeps on repeating. The disciples of Jesus are called to be witnesses for Jesus. And the sense we get is that's still the call today. Being a disciple and being a witness go hand in hand. You can't be the former without taking on the latter. So what might we take from our passage today that might help us as we seek to be witnesses for Jesus? One of the things I notice about Jesus from our passage today is that Jesus' eyes were open. Jesus noticed the people around him. And we heard a story a few weeks ago about Paul when he was in Athens. And I talked about how it was clear that Paul was aware of his surroundings. Well, here we see that in Jesus. And it wasn't that he just noticed people, but he looked past the surface of people to deep within them. Listen to what it says, verses 35 and 36. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. You know, as we read through the various Jesus stories in the Bible, one of the things that stands out a lot is how Jesus so often was so ready to notice people. If you know the story about Zacchaeus was hiding in a tree, and Jesus noticed him and called him down. If you know the story about Bartimaeus, the blind man, as Jesus was in Jericho, Jesus was on the outskirts, and Bartimaeus heard that Jesus was there, and he was shouting. There was a lot of commotion going around, and Jesus noticed the call of Bartimaeus. Jesus was always looking outward. He was always focused on the people around him, always aware of people and their needs. It's so easy for us to turn our attention inwards, isn't it? So easy for us to adopt a tunnel vision approach to life. Zero in on the things we need to do. Focus on the things we want to get done. Have you ever caught yourself being unaware of things around you? You almost bump into something because you just haven't been thinking. Perhaps you've been looking down at your smartphone and you bump into something and you don't quite realize where you are. Cell phones are a great thing. I love the fact that I can contact Mandy or the kids at any point. They can contact me. I can contact my parents. They can contact me if they need to. I like to be able to keep up with information on my smartphone. But for many of us, smartphones have almost become our masters, haven't they? Can't seem to live without them. So many people nowadays walking with their heads down, looking at their smartphones. Now, I don't think Jesus is saying get rid of your phones. But if we're trying to become like him, what needs to become our longing is that our eyes become like Jesus' eyes. As Jesus went around from place to place, Jesus noticed not just things, but far more importantly, Jesus noticed people, and he gave those people his attention. There are so many people around us, people who don't feel worthy, people who don't feel good enough, people who don't feel loved or appreciated, people who experience an emptiness inside of them. They're longing for some deeper meaning in life. Just imagine how their lives might be changed if they came to know God's unbounded love for them. Their lives would be transformed. Lord, open our eyes to see all around us. Help us to see people, to see beyond what's on the outside. Help us to recognize the longing that's within. So I want to ask you, who might Jesus be calling you to see this day? Let's keep going. What else do we notice from our passage today? Well, one of the things I see in Jesus is the response that he has for the people that he's seen. Verse 36. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Now, I've spoken before about the need of sheep for a shepherd. Without a shepherd around, sheep can be in danger. They can be in danger of wild animals. They can be in danger of wandering away and getting lost. It's not always intentional when they do that. Sometimes they just put their heads down, start eating the grass, and just start walking. And the next time they lift up their heads, they realize they're far from the rest of the flock and far from the shepherd. Now, some shepherds, they could tire of wandering sheep. I'm sure there would have been some shepherds back in Jesus' day. I mean, Jesus often referred to the hired ones who really didn't care for their sheep. And I can imagine that there would be some shepherds in Jesus' day who really weren't all that bothered. Some who would maybe just let the sheep wander, or perhaps they would treat them harshly when they did wander. But in our story today, that's not what we see from Jesus, is it? No, those who had wandered, those who had lived as though they had no shepherd, Jesus had compassion. I think it's important for us to understand that word, because the word compassion to us, often it just means, it's kind of a sentimental emotion. It means feeling sad for something or someone. In the Greek word is splankizomai, and it actually means something far more than any sentimental emotion. It's something that affects somebody right down in the guts of them. It was like a feeling deep within them. There was an ache deep within Jesus, right at the core of his being. Isn't that often a real difference between us and Jesus? While Jesus allowed things to affect him deeply, often we don't. I mean, sometimes we'll blame people for their own problems, how they've wandered away. It's their fault. And we'll let people find their own way back. Sometimes we desensitize ourselves to the needs of others. Sure, we might see their needs, but quickly we turn away, so those things don't really affect us. Does that ring true for you? And yet, just imagine how things might be affected if we recognize the compassion Jesus has for us and then allowed that compassion to spill out from us towards the people around us. So I want to ask you, what example might Jesus point to where your heart doesn't reflect his when it comes to the needs of the people around you? And what is Jesus saying to you about that today? If our purpose as disciples is to become more and more like Jesus, then not only do we need Jesus' eyes, but we need Jesus' heart. Lord, please open our hearts. So let's keep going. What else do we see in the passage? Well, something else that I've already touched on is that whole notion of the qualification of the disciples. How they would have felt way in over their head as Jesus sent them out in mission. I don't think they would have felt qualified. I'm sure as Jesus said the words, "I am sending you," their hearts were racing. I mean, these weren't exceptional people. As Matthew names them in our passage today, we really have a raggedy bunch. I mean, the first person that Matthew names, he went and denied Jesus. The last person betrayed Jesus. One of the people in the middle doubted Jesus. Two other disciples, they were at odds with each other. One for a time at least, worked for the Romans, and the other one fought against the Romans. This was a raggedy bunch. In reality, it was a group of misfits. Certainly not a group of people filled with those that you would expect to be qualified to serve as witnesses for Jesus. And I think that's one of the most important things here. The fact that they weren't qualified, and yet they still were called to be witnesses. I don't know who was the first person ever to say this, but it's something I think it's important for us to remember. God doesn't call the qualified. God qualifies the called. God doesn't wait until you have all the skills necessary. Doesn't say, stay until I know you're going to get everything perfect when you leave. No, instead, while the disciples were still learning, still stumbling along the way, he says there are others that need you. Others that need you to help them find their way. It's not about us being qualified, it's about us being called. In essence, it's about us being willing to open our hands to receive that qualifying from Jesus. Opening ourselves up and leaning in on Jesus that we might reach the people around us. So I want to ask you, to what extent do you look to your own capabilities when it comes to being a witness for Jesus? And what is Jesus saying to you about that today? Briefly, one more thing I want to share with you this morning. There still might be people who are feeling a little bit daunted by the prospect of saying yes to going out in mission for Jesus. I think it's important for us to take note of the message that Jesus sent out with his disciples. It wasn't a message of theology. It wasn't some deep intellectual doctrine that people had to understand and come to terms with. No, it's something far more straightforward. Remember the message. Verse 7, as you go, proclaim the message, the kingdom of heaven has come near. Yes, Jesus was sending disciples to go and do something. But far more importantly, he was sending them out to be his people in the world, to live according to God's purpose, to reflect Jesus in all aspects of their lives, that they might have an impact. That's what Jesus is calling for from you and me, that we might go and live the kingdom in such a way that the world might see. You know, there's this wonderful story about St. Francis, the 13th century monk, who one day informed his brethren that he planned to go to a nearby village on a preaching mission. He invited a novice to go along with him. On their way, they passed an injured man, and Francis promptly stopped, saw to the poor man's needs, and arranged medical care for him. They went on and soon passed a homeless man who was near starvation. Again, Francis stopped his journey and ministered to the hungry homeless man. So it went throughout the day, people in need, Francis lovingly caring for people as best he could, until the sun was low in the sky. He told his novice friend it was time for them to return to the monastery for evening prayers. But the young man said, "Father, you said we were coming to town to preach to people." Francis smiled. Then he said, "My friend, that's what we've been doing all day." Now, I'm not saying that mission is never about words. In fact, I think as we seek to go out in mission, it's imperative that people know what we're about. That at some point, people come to know that what we do because of Jesus. And yet I believe it makes no difference what our words are if in our lives people don't see Jesus. So I want to ask you, how is Jesus calling you to be living the kingdom today? And what might that living look like? What might that living look like today? How might that living today look different from it looked yesterday? Many years ago, Jesus made it clear that the harvest was ready. I believe it's even more ready today. There are people we know who need to see and hear about the kingdom. And they're waiting to discover the kingdom from you and me. Will we simply hold back in hope that others might reach them? Will we assume that we just aren't qualified? Or will we accept the mission to which we are called? Jesus is holding today a sign. And it's a sign that says, help wanted. Let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you that you call us to be partners with you in proclaiming your kingdom, to living your kingdom in the world. Lord, give us eyes to see the needs of people. Give us a heart of compassion, a longing that we reach people for you. Give us the realization that it's not in our capabilities, but it's in yours, that you qualify us. Lord, help us to proclaim your kingdom in our words and our actions to the glory of your name. We ask these things in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.